September 27th, 2073. They arrived exactly 25 years ago today, but I feel like I remember every detail of that day vividly, as if I could wander anywhere within that space and time that I chose to. People I've spoken to have often described it in almost the same way, and yet some barely remember it at all. I suppose they were in a kind of shock. Either way, one thing we all knew was that the world would never be the same again. It was a Tuesday, late morning, sun-drenched and cloudless. It was chillier than usual for that time of year, but nevertheless, it was like any other day. Then suddenly, I saw people, one after another, getting a news flash on their phones. I looked at mine. A lone spaceship had appeared, hovering a few miles off the ground, somewhere over Newfoundland. People who were there and witnessed it said it was like a magic trick. The ship was just there, and it was massive beyond anything you'd imagine. On television a few days later, they said it measured about half the size of Connecticut. For some reason, they picked the town of Labrador in Newfoundland. I never found out why that was. Maybe it was chosen because there was nothing special about it. They didn't show a preference for any major city or country, which could have been misinterpreted for favoritism. Anyway, it had to be somewhere. The ship just hovered there, absolutely motionless for nearly 3 days, with no obvious signs of activity. I think they did pick up some electromagnetic pulses, but otherwise there was nothing. No light or sound, just the unbearable suspense. So after a couple of days, I think most people just tuned out and figured that we'd know whenever we know. Were they going to destroy us? Turn us into slaves? Take over the planet? People started making dark jokes about what our inevitable fate might be. I mean, seriously though, what were we going to do about it? It was apparent to everyone how technologically advanced they were. Hundreds of years ahead? Maybe thousands. They were going to do whatever they felt like doing. We didn't even bother making the display of military force that you'd expect, like they always did in the movies. We were just in awe. And so, we waited. Finally, late afternoon on the third day, we heard a wave-like sound reverberating for a few minutes. It wasn't loud, and yet people still reported hearing it from hundreds of miles away. Then several of the forms began to appear and take shape slowly in front of the cameras. It took about 20 seconds in all, and then 8 of them stood there, fully formed. Each of them was about 9 feet tall. They clearly looked otherworldly, but there were also many surprising similarities to humans in their appearance. That was one thing that some depictions got right of what aliens might look like. Again though, like with their technology, they were probably thousands of years ahead of us in physical evolutionary development, if that's even how it worked with them. Did they reproduce and evolve in any way as we had? We still don't know very much about them. After a couple of minutes, surveying each of us and the surroundings, one of them spoke. And that itself was miraculous. They never moved their lips, but everyone, wherever they were in the world, heard that voice at the same time, and in their native language. We later learned a bit more about how they could transmit thoughts, plant ideas and images in our heads, or read our minds. Their voices, we found out eventually, were a combination of tones, composed of 12 different layers, each communicating different elements of a message. Some were inaudible to the human ear. It was essentially like an orchestra playing a musical score, although we couldn't hear all the different intonations. But why were they here? This was the question we all desperately needed an answer to. They explained they were part of a team of galactic explorers, sent out to chart different civilizations in this universe, wherever they were found. Several signals were coming from our planet that allowed them to hone in and pinpoint our location. But aside from the things they told us which calmed our fears, we were seduced by their overwhelming benevolence. They projected a sense of depth and empathy, of genuine humanity, that emanated from them with every gesture. Their facial expressions were incredibly complex, but they were somehow also immediately readable to us, If they felt kindness or sadness, minute ripples would appear across their faces, like hundreds of muscles attuned to convey different nuances of an emotion, and you felt it with more impact than you have ever felt that emotion before. But at the same time, their emotional vocabulary was just beyond what we could comprehend. That first visit, they spent several weeks with us, exploring all different aspects of our planet and culture. Art, music, science, and social interactions of all kinds. They learned with incredible computer-like speed. Everything seemed fascinating to them, and they soaked in every detail. But they would never talk much about themselves or their advancements. They said we had to progress naturally from our own experiences as much as possible without their influence. And of course, many people wanted to know whether or not they thought there was a God. That and other questions, they said, were also still up to us to work through. When they told us a few weeks later that they had learned and experienced what they needed to, and that it was time for them to move on, we had formed such a strong connection for them that it was like our very best friends were leaving. They also left with parting words, the first which hit like an anvil. Of all the civilizations they had charted, among the ones they classified as advanced cultures, we had ranked nearly at the very bottom. I think there was a hint of sadness when they reported this to us. It was like the look a doctor would have when they needed to give you terrible news. It was empathetic, but at the same time just the painful facts that we had to be told. It gave us some comfort at least when they said that they'd be returning every couple of years or so for a follow-up visit. And then, they left. I can't describe the profound feeling of emptiness I had for the next few days. It seemed like we had all just woken up from a dream. Had it really happened? Yes, it did. Aliens had visited our planet. They came in an actual spaceship. Many other civilizations do exist in our universe. As the euphoria wore off though, their departing messages began to sink in as well. The universe wasn't about us. We were not exceptional. In fact, as far as civilizations go, we were a disappointment. And if there even was a God, humans were just another creation. For several years afterward, the whole world together went through what experts described as similar to 5 psychological stages that people experience when they try to come to terms with devastating news. First, there was denial. Some variation of, "That's ridiculous. We can't be one of the worst civilizations in the universe." Soon, that changed. Many commentators on television would get resentful and angry about one thing or other. We mostly pointed fingers at other countries or groups as the ones who were responsible for our low score. On their next visit, we wanted to tell them every positive thing we could think of about ourselves, like there was something they must have missed. How deeply we loved our children, examples of great philanthropy, heroism, or of people helping one another. This was the stage they called bargaining. But finally, it seemed like we couldn't avoid the truth any longer and had to come to terms with who we were. This worldwide depression crept in everywhere. It was often subtle, but it was always there. People looked a bit lost and empty, without purpose, and there was a kind of joylessness. This lasted for several years. But then, something seemingly miraculous happened. I couldn't point to any one thing. No event stood out. And it wasn't a specific time, over a day, a week, or a month. It just happened. We chose to be different. We agreed that we would be better. It was never stated outright. We just got it. Psychologists had predicted that we'd eventually get to this phase of acceptance. But we didn't accept it. About 17 years ago, they convened the first International Confederation of Cooperative Countries, the ICCC, and every country signed up immediately. Occasionally, people would start bickering about something or other, but then they'd catch themselves and get back on track. One of the new abiding principles we call MAC, or Mutually Assured Construction. All sides would focus on helping each other along with themselves. Compromises had to be mutually beneficial, and they strived to accomplish the most obvious but critical things that genuinely improved all our lives. War was the first and easiest thing to stop, which surprised us. But it was simple. Any kind of weapons or violence had to be off the table. We strove to make generous conciliations on all sides, and once we started focusing much more on global interests instead of national ones, challenging conflicts often resolved themselves quickly. We've also made tremendous progress in eradicating poverty. Almost everyone all over the world is assured of having particular basic needs met: food, housing, medicine. Before this, the news had constantly been occupied with ominous warnings about one thing or another, like frightening future prospects for clean air and water or killer microbes. There is more violence overall, like shootings or rioting, but these stories are rare now. It's obviously not that we fixed everything, but people just have confidence that if there's a real problem in the world, we're making the best effort we can as a global community to solve it. And this feeling of hope and optimism is reflected in so many ways. We all seem to feel a responsibility in helping to make things work. On one of the aliens' follow-up visits about 10 years ago, our score had noticeably improved. Recently, I think they even showed some admiration for our attitude and accomplishments. But we are doing it for ourselves, and that feels great.